Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the Future Seeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. The speaker for this episode is Lyn Carson. Carson is a retired professor in applied politics and is specialized in a field called deliberative democracy. And she's one of the founders and lead researcher in an organization called NewDemocracy. Carson's detailed insight on the nature and the different variations of democracy is incredibly valuable. You will hear her explaining what variation of democracy you currently live in, why democracy needs to be upgraded, and what are the democratic innovations that are being trialed in Iceland, Spain, Belgium, Brazil, and Switzerland. Hello, Carson. Are you there?
Hello. Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you for this interview. Welcome. I'm going to start by introducing you. You used to be a professor in applied politics in the University of Sydney and Lismore, from what I understand. Is that correct?
I started in Lismore. I eventually went to Sydney, and I also spent time not only in the University of Sydney, but also at the University of Western Sydney. So I've been in several academies, but mostly University of Sydney.
Right. And what are you doing today?
At the moment, I'm the research director for the New Democracy Foundation, which is a non-government research institute that I helped to develop about 10 years ago. And now I'm acting as both a member of the board, but also as the research director.
Right. That sounds passionate. What does your research consist in?
I'm mostly doing evaluations and critical reflections on deliberative democracy experiments. So we're particularly interested in ways that can draw typical citizens into political decision making. So we often have oversight of some of these experiments. They're generically called mini publics or miniature populations. And as a research director, I'm looking closely at those. I'm writing about various aspects of those, all of which can be found on the New Democracy website.
Yeah, I'm on the not New Democracy, but Active Democracy right now. I'm looking at it, and it says you're participating in Australia's first consensus conference, Australia's first 2 deliberative polls, and number of citizen juries, etc.
I have been involved in these experiments from the time that I was elected to local government in the 90s in Lismore. And after that, I had a chance to work in various ways with consensus conferences, deliberative polls, citizens' juries, and in particular, the Australian Citizens' Parliament in 2009, a huge project. And since then, on many citizens' juries, solutions panels, and so on.
Many of our listeners don't know all these words, so
I know, yeah, and it's I've
let's
often
get right into it.
Okay,
Because that's going to come in. So, my first question was, what is democracy, and how has it changed and morphed throughout the ages?
yeah. I mean, the work that I do is in a very particular area called deliberative democracy. But let me just stay with your question for now, and think about democracy more generally, more generically. I'm a bit fond of the way that David Runciman describes this long history of democracy, and I think there's a long story, a middle story, and a short story, and that's the kind of language that he uses. So if you look at the long story, then we're looking at 2,500 years ago at the ancient Greeks and the way in which they did something incredibly unusual for the time, and that was to use a lottery to select its citizens, admittedly only men, not foreigners or slaves or women, to make political decisions on a daily basis, often involving hundreds or thousands of Greeks to do that. So that's the long story. And it lasted for hundreds of years, which is kind of the length of our current system, but I'll come to that. The middle story occurred around the time of the French, the American, the English revolutions. And it was when a choice was made about what kind of democracy, and I'd almost want to put that in inverted commas, what kind of democracy should replace the very hierarchical, royal houses that were around at the time. And they chose the Roman model. They did not choose the Greek model based on lotteries. They chose the Republican model. And that pretty much guaranteed that power would be situated amongst elites, the people who had money. And so we went from the long story of what I would think of as a pretty amazing democracy to a middle story where it was replaced with something which I think is more accurately described as representative government rather than democracy, to a short story which has really only happened in the last 100 years. And that's much more about universal franchise, about giving everyone the vote, including women, which has been a long project over that time. But it's also been the time during which the two-party system, or definitely the party system, has been cemented as part of this representative government. So you can see we've moved a long way from original forms of democracy to what we have now, but we persist in calling it democracy. And in fact, the term was not even used in the American Constitution. They did not like the idea of democracy at all because they argued that you would end up with the masses, the guillotine or whatever. It was a very neat argument in order to secure decision-making for political elites. And I think we're stuck with that, actually. I think we do have, I think we do have a political system that is pretty much.
But in the last 50 years, in the last 50 years, there's more experiments and innovations coming in around democracy.
There definitely are, yeah. I think, and that would take me to the kind of work that I do in deliberative democracy. And over the past 50 years, definitely since the early 70s, there have been not just experiments, but ways in which some of these ideas, these mini publics, have been used. Firstly, in America as citizens' juries, in Germany as planning cells, in Australia as citizens' juries, consensus conferences. More recently, we're seeing the emergence of citizens' assemblies, and you're probably familiar with that through examples like the Irish example that fairly recently led to a change in abortion laws, in marriage equality, and at the moment is looking at policies around climate change, amongst other things. And there have been citizens' assemblies in Canada, the Netherlands, Iceland.
Can you, just for our listeners, define a bit mini publics and planning cells, citizen juries?
So a citizens' jury is a fairly small scale. It usually involves, somewhere between 12 and 25 people, although the work we've been doing lately, we often use as many as 40 people in a citizens' jury. They come together over a period of time, very intensively. They deliberate, which is why that term deliberative democracy has emerged. So they deliberate together and try to establish their common ground in order to make recommendations. And during those deliberations, they hear from experts, they read a whole lot of information. They're very educated, the people who are part of these intensive processes. And then they make recommendations to a decision maker, which should be agreed in advance, will be acted upon. So that's a citizens' jury. A planning cell works slightly differently in that it's a bunch of simultaneous, I guess you could say, juries, in that you might have 20 of them on a given topic in Germany. Maybe there's 25 people in each. Usually that's the number that they would involve. So over a fairly, again, intensive, but over a period of time, they will have had 500 people participate on a given topic. A citizens' assembly is a larger scale version of that. So in Australia, when we did the Australian Citizens' Parliament, there were 150 people, one from every electorate in Australia, that came together for 4 days in one location in Canberra and made recommendations. A citizens' assembly usually follows that model. So there's usually about 100 or 150 people. This always involves random selection. Any of the models that I've just talked about always use random selection in order to get a very diverse group into the room, and a citizens' assembly does just that. Ireland did it slightly differently in that they had 66 randomly selected people and 33 elected representatives, so that they could encourage the elected representatives to share ownership of the decisions and ensure that they were taken through the parliament. So you'll get variations, but they always share, these methods always share three ideals: that they'll be very inclusive, almost always using a lottery or random selection. They will be deeply deliberative, so they'll take a lot of time, a lot of learning, and they will always be influential. So it has to mean something. It's not just bringing people together for a chat. It's bringing them together because there's an important decision to be made. Does that give you enough information?
Yeah, and all that brings me to the place where you and I met, which was the Byron model. And the Byron model follows everything you just said. And I was lucky enough to be selected in the random stratified selection. What kind of mini public was that?
That was a citizens' jury, yes. So you have had a first-hand experience of a citizens' jury and are very equipped to talk about what that was like.
It was amazing. I was very impressed by the whole process and the facilitators.
Which raises an additional point, which is that these mini publics are always facilitated by an independent facilitator, someone who will allow the group to find its own way. So it's very important that that facilitator is neutral, is not imposing an agenda, but is simply there in order to enable the group to end up where it wants to end up.
Yeah, and giving a lot of interesting information on how to judge objectively the situation. And I really feel it was neutral. The tools and strategies that were used to facilitate were really high quality in all the sessions that we went through. It was a great experience.
I think you're also pointing to the fact that we really want to alert participants to the importance of critical thinking and cognitive biases. So we want to, if we can, impart the skills of interrogating expert knowledge, because we don't want people to be hoodwinked or, cajoled and manipulated in any way. We want those participants to really question the information that they are hearing, which I think in your case study, your own experience happened. I think there are a lot of people who were asking fantastic questions and really interrogating any expert knowledge that came their way.
Yeah, well, again, for the listeners, the Byron model was an initiative that was facilitated by NewDemocracy, and the Council of the Byron Shire ordered this study, and they have to follow the recommendation for the next 2 years. Is that right, Carson?
That's exactly right, yeah.
And so we put together this very modern, interesting process with the scale of impact and how deep you must engage the population for each topic that they're not going to have to work with.
Indeed, and I think it was a very unusual subject area in that the Byron Council was very interested in knowing how could it create a model for local democracy that really maximised trust in both the council and its ability to work with citizens. So it may be that it was a precedent that we hope is going to be taken up in other local governments throughout the world, that we actually give the people themselves an opportunity to say how they want to be governed, which is pretty exciting, really.
It was, and I'm very fond of the basic principles we wrote down, which was trust, communication, identity. I want to add on this point that you've said many times that you don't really like direct democracy or surveys because all it gives is opinions, and opinions are usually not informed. There's no critical thinking. Can you develop that?
Yeah, I think you've expressed that well. So the difference between direct democracy and deliberative democracy is that direct democracy, let's think about something like a referendum, is a collection, an aggregation of what people's opinion is of something. Now, you can come unstuck with that because if it's not informed, all you're getting is an aggregation of public opinion. Whereas I'm incredibly interested in deliberative democracy because what you're getting there is public judgment. So you're saying that we can harness the collective intelligence of the whole community, and together we can arrive at recommendations that are very sound because they're based on reason. They're not based on the kind of emotion that you might get if you ask someone in a survey, what do you think of this, eh? And, surveys are notoriously inaccurate, as we just discovered in Australia in the last election, where the predictions were contrary to what actually happened. So giving an opinion is superficial, it's fairly meaningless, whereas that kind of deep deliberation is going to result in something else. I mean, there are examples of direct democracy which are a little bit stronger than the way that I've just conceptualized it. So I'm thinking of somewhere like Switzerland.
That was my next question. What's the best democracy in the world today?
Yeah, and I don't know whether I wouldn't want to dismiss Switzerland because it does use direct democracy. It's not necessarily deliberative democracy, but there is such a strong culture of direct democracy in Switzerland. They've been doing this for decades, so that people do engage, I think, fairly meaningfully and genuinely with the kind of propositions that are put forward to them. So I think you can actually encourage a culture of direct democracy that encourages that kind of thoughtful questioning and conversation. It may be that Switzerland has come some way towards this. It's certainly the only country that you could point to if you're saying, what's the best democracy in the world. There are places that we can point to. I've talked about Ireland and its citizens' assemblies, and it's now done a number of them. It may be that Ireland begins to institutionalise citizens' assemblies, so it just does them routinely, which would mean that it's coming awfully close to being a really good example of democracy. There's at least one place in Belgium, there's a German-speaking region in Belgium that has just created what one could describe as a permanent citizens' assembly that is sitting alongside its parliament. So it can convene mini publics, it can set agendas, it can do a whole lot of things. This is actually very exciting in my opinion, and I think it's a way for other regions, for other countries, for other states to go, is to start thinking about ways in which they can permanently be in partnership with randomly selected citizens in something like a citizens' assembly. So there are pockets of it. The frustration for me is that I feel like I sit in the middle of the most incredible democratic innovation going on all over the world because I'm hearing about it all the time. But I think if you don't hear about that and you just read newspapers or watch television or access social media, you would have a very strong sense that we are experiencing the most extraordinary democratic deficit and that things are quite dire. And it's true that the democracies really are weakening, but there are so many fantastic examples of where good things are happening that it's great that we're talking about it. It's really good for people to know that there are alternatives that are working incredibly well.
Yeah, there's a lot happening around the world. Could you tell us a tiny bit, very quickly, about what happened in Madrid and in Iceland?
Yeah, I mean, Madrid in many ways is both a fantastic story and potentially a a sad story in that Madrid developed a method, was, based on some work that New Democracy indirectly was part of, but it ended up being a direct democracy method. That is, people could go online and offer ideas to the local government, the city government of Madrid. And the Madrid Council created what it called an observatory, and that involved randomly selected people coming together as a mini public to look at those ideas and work out what should go to a referendum. And they could also, that mini public could also propose referendum ideas. Unfortunately, there's just been a change of government in Madrid, and it's back to the problem of political elites, perhaps, that it's just unknown whether this is going to survive. This fantastic example that emerged in Madrid may very well stumble as a result of a new, fairly right-wing government that doesn't have too much interest in persisting with this. Iceland was an example of, they changed their constitution using online platforms as well as face-to-face deliberations. So it's extraordinary, really, when you think about constitutional reform using the kinds of methods that I've talked about, but in many ways earning way more trust. If you have a constitutional convention that is made up of political elites, then everyone is deeply suspicious that it's probably going to be reformed in a way that's going to perpetuate their future. Whereas if you put it back in the hands of the population using various methods, then there's an awful lot more trust involved in what's likely to arise.
And as we saw in our study, trust is the key.
Absolutely, fundamental. And we are in a situation where trust is declining in governments. I've said I don't really trust surveys, but all the surveys tell us that trust in government is in decline. Not just trust in government, but also people's willingness to vote, which I think can be a bit of an empty ritual, as I said. But even in a country like Australia that has compulsory voting, I think we saw the lowest turnout amongst young people in the last election. And these sorts of issues around trust and belief in the system do have, they have consequences.
Yeah. Maybe that brings me to my next question again. Transparency International said that since 2006, 113 countries have seen a decline in their democracy scores. So what fundamental rights does an individual need to lose for government to lose its entitlement to use the title democracy?
Yeah, what's occurring now is, in many ways, it's really subtle. A lot of it is attributable to social media, as we know. You'd only have to look at the Cambridge Analytica example and the way in which people can be targeted in a very personal way with messages that are going to influence how they vote, for example. So that's not a diminution of their rights. It's much more subtle. I've started to think that it's around a whole lot of illnesses, political illnesses that start with the letter P. I think I'm starting to collect them. Things like polarization, and I think social media is, it does result in more polarization. Populism, that, people are reacting to elections as though they are reality TV shows, and that you can elect a buffoon and that's an appropriate act. Pessimism, I think those who look closely at these circumstances are starting to be very pessimistic, and that can be quite dulling and deadening. I think there are pathologies associated with political parties where they have their eye on short-termism, on the next election, and not so much on long-term sound policies. And then there's that dominance of political elites. And as you could hear, there are a lot of P's associated with that. So I don't know whether I'm
Uh-huh.
developing a theory here, but I am starting to think that it is that more subtle stuff that is happening that is way more scary than the elimination of certain rights, although one would not want to lose those either.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought it was quite a big number, 113 countries since
Yeah.
2006. But so how, based on all those examples you gave, things that are happening around the world, what would you say is a good strategy for people to push for more democracy, whether it be locally or on a bigger scale?
If I could change one thing, I would encourage people not to see the vote as the beginning and the end of their political activity, because I think there's been a way in which that instrument has been oversold. You know, that if we just get this vote and we vote for pre-selected candidates, and it's really quite meaningless. You know, a pencil every 3 or 4 years in a polling booth is not the way that I think democracy was ever meant to work. If I go back to ancient Athens, it was about governing and being governed in turn, you know, that we were meant to take turns, letting someone govern, and then we assume the position of someone who can do the governing. This is difficult in huge populations, but it's not difficult at a local government level. And the reason that was an ideal was that we were meant to be able to accomplish things together. That's the whole purpose of it, is so that we could actually share meaning and get on with accomplishing things. So I want to take people back to how you do that. Inevitably, that takes you back to local government. I mean, it is a very poor cousin of state government in Australia, though that differs throughout the world. But there's no reason why we can't assume responsibility for our own futures at a local level. I mean, you and I happen to be part of the Byron local government area, and I would say this area is actually pretty good at that. You know, I think we do have a council that's willing to share that with its residents. I think it is going about doing that, and I'd like to think that we could spread the kind of activity that is going on here elsewhere and encourage people to do just that, to advocate citizens' juries, to resolve issues, to just spend a bit of time advocating for process. You know, I think that's really underestimated. We think that activists have a way of protesting about issues instead of protesting about process. And if you get the decision-making method right, then everything else just falls into place. You know,
Being an IT person, I always think systems are quite important.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I spent a big part of my life being an activist in one area or another, and then I realized, hey, it's how are decisions being made here? And I think that's what took me into this very interesting area, which is political decision making. But I mean, decision making generally is pretty fascinating to me.
You did show us a few examples of things happening and processes being changed in Geelong, Tweed, Lismore, all around on the local level.
Yeah, there's some really good stuff happening locally. I think there's some interesting stuff happening locally around climate change, actually. You know, that local areas are developing climate emergency plans. They're acting on it in a way. I mean, that is absolutely fantastic. People just taking responsibility for their own destiny alone, it's not going to be enough. We know that. We know that we need some big policy directions as well. But you have to start somewhere. And if those methods are used at a local level and gather some momentum, then one would hope that it will translate into that bigger context.
Yeah, which it follows very well with the two next questions I was going to ask, which is, what's the true value of democracy in helping to build a more humane world? You said just a second ago that originally the idea of democracy is to enable us to build together, accomplish together, and create meaning.
That's true. And I think it's why I just love the whole notion of democracy. I think it can build a more humane world. I think we have this extraordinary capacity as humans to both think about power in ways that are very destructive, but also to think about power in ways that are incredibly constructive. And I guess we just need to stay focused on that constructive idea of collective decision making, ways in which we can actually work together. I mean, you have had that experience of a citizens' jury. You know that when people come together who have very different ideas, very different backgrounds, it's extraordinary the level of agreement that exists. And it's
True.
actually quite easy to work with that agreement, whereas we are living in a world that is so focused on disagreement, on discord, on what makes us different rather than what makes us alike and what is it that we want to accomplish together. I think when people come together, they always make sound decisions. They always step aside from their own self-interest, which they come in with initially, understandably, but by the end of it, have a very strong sense of public interest or common good, that they just move beyond their own backyard, and start to think about the wider community in ways that are really quite moving, I think. I'm always...
Yeah, I've seen it. There's this very funny example in our group with a person entering the first day being very, very focused on the potholes. And then a few days later realizing, oh, it's a much larger issue.
Yeah, that's right.
But let's imagine for a second that we're in an ideal world, a world where we've already managed to establish truly democratic processes everywhere. How would that, in which way would that help us to solve the big problems of this world? Thinking, of course, about climate change, but also democracy, poverty, and could there be a domino effect of having better democracies on all of those problems?
Yes, I think there could. I think it's going to require. I know that I always hold Gramsci's phrase close to my heart about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. That I think we can be very pessimistic in the face of what we see around us, but there is some kind of optimism of our will, our collective will, that I think can see us through. I would be repeating myself to say that I do think that it is dependent upon this diverse groupings of citizens and what they can do together that would have that kind of domino effect. I'm seeing it in my world, in my deliberative democracy world, because I'm part of an international network that is constantly learning from each other. So we see something that happens in one country and say, aha, why couldn't that work in my country? So an experiment that happens in a developing country might then pop up in a Western country. And it's not always the other way around. I'm thinking of something like the participatory budgets that started in Porto Alegre in Brazil, and then before we knew it, they were happening in developed countries. And the reverse is also true, that we're currently doing a project for the UN that is working in a bunch of countries throughout the world that I think has real potential for change. So, yeah, I think a domino effect is entirely possible while ever we can maintain some optimism of the will.
Yeah, you were holding a panel recently in this more on the topic of democracy and climate change. What was the conclusion? How does democracy help with the climate crisis?
I think it helps in that it's somewhat of pincer movement, I think. If you think about the way that we do activism or make decisions as involving insisted spaces and invited spaces, you can see that a positive outcome is possible. And by that I mean, if you think about an insisted space as people taking to the streets like they are through organisations like Extinction Rebellion, demanding change, I would see that as an insisted space. And alone, I don't think it's going to be effective, but it's essential. I think it's really important that people do make noise. But I'm interested in the other end of that, which is the invited spaces. So I'm interested in how you can bring people along in a decision-making space to help develop policy directions around things like climate change, because I think elected representatives are just way too fearful. They're influenced by business groups, by industry, although I have to say even industry is saying we have to do something at the moment. I just think that it's not a good decision-making mechanism for something like this. And therefore, I think they will need to reach out and create different decision-making mechanisms. And citizens' assemblies are the most obvious way of doing that. Now, that's an invited space. And I think that combination of diverse group of people making sound recommendations about how we must act needs to happen alongside of that insisted space. And I notice that groups like Extinction Rebellion are currently calling for citizens' assemblies. So they have, I think, realised that they need that combination. My only concern with that is that the UK is currently, it's just announced that it's going to have a citizens' assembly on climate change. And I don't much like the method that they're going to employ. It's too short. You know, there's a bunch of things that are not going to deliver something that I would regard as sound. And I suppose that raises a very important aspect for me, that these methods that I've been talking about have to be extremely robust. They need to have oversight by people who understand how you maintain the integrity of the process. Otherwise, they can be used and abused by people who don't have the best interests of citizens at heart.
Yeah, like every little detail of the process is important. The length, the number of people, the facilitators, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Very interesting answers. Thank you. I'd like now to ask you a few questions related to technology. And my first one, very simple. How does technology at the moment support democracy?
At the moment, I don't think it supports it very well. I think it's one of the enemies of democracy for the reasons that I talked about earlier, because for each of technology's strengths, there's a dreadful danger, it seems to me. And the sorts of things I'm referring to are obviously fake news, or, you know, its polarizing effect, its appeal to emotion rather than reason, and so on. So I'm not a great fan of technology in the democratic space. I keep wanting to default to face-to-face. But having said that, I think there are ways in which you can combine the two. I think that's what they were hoping to do in Madrid, to have a way in which technology could bring in everyone and then have a deliberative space of random, you know, a civic lottery of people to just sift through all of that data, if you like. But I think it always must be complemented with a face-to-face deliberative method. Otherwise, I seriously question its value.
Yeah, you're talking about the discussion aspect, the exchange aspect of democracy.
Yeah.
How to build ideas and agree.
I think technology is great for just extracting ideas, you know, but it's not great at deliberation.
Yeah, but very soon we'll have everything digitized. So the communication, the deliberation, the voting, the controlling, the monitoring, all the aspects of democracy will be digitized. I understand what you said on the negative aspect of that, if we all wanted to discuss ideas, but is there maybe another threat to democracy if you start digitizing everything?
I'd love it if you could convince me that there was some value here, but all I seem to be able to see is its vulnerability to corruption, that there will always be ways in which it can be manipulated. And it's very difficult to manipulate a group of diverse citizens. They become very good critical thinkers and call each other on anything, whereas the electronic space is so far notoriously bad at it. It's been interesting to me over the last, I would say, 10, maybe more years, to watch people try to create a deliberative version of an online environment, and so far without success. There are ways in which we could do something like an informed referendum. We could insist upon people reading information that was, very diverse. We could, but everything that we try to do, I think, I can see how that could be gamed, So, yeah,
I
look,
know there's
I'm a
many.
cynic. I am a cynic.
All right, so I want to bring those two aspects together: the really high technology and the very fact that we invented democracy for us humans to discuss and agree on things. So imagine a world in which artificial intelligence will be so advanced that it could calculate and predict the best systems and the best rules for each and every situation. Let's just imagine that for a second. And I think in such a world, if that would exist, we'd likely rely on those calculations more than we'd rely on people's opinions to make decisions. And in such a world, relying on humans to deliberate and vote and make effective decisions wouldn't make sense. It would be laughable. But if we did that, what's your opinion on that? What fundamental part of life and of the human experience would we be giving up if we were to develop a world in which we give our power of decision to computers?
I love it. Sort of like it starts with, now, if pigs could fly, then blah, 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 blah. So, okay, I'm going to imagine that pigs can fly and
Yeah.
that is even possible. And what would we be giving up? I think we would be giving up what I see as the most extraordinary experience, to be able to look each other in the eye and to understand each other in ways that have so far proven to be impossible without that face-to-face experience. That there is something so fantastic about being in the company of another and trying to work out not just what you have in common, but to actually share meaning and to fully understand that. To actually be able to stand in another person's shoes is very difficult online, but it's so easy face to face. So there is a relational thing that happens in the company of others that it's very difficult to emulate online. So I think we'd be giving that up, the very thing that I think makes us truly human. It's difficult to imagine people giving a fig about justice and equality and so on, unless they were in the company of others. And if the company of others shrinks to our own family or our own very homogenous circle of friends, then I think we're going to end up with even more polarization. I think we resist plurality. We resist diversity. You know, how many of your friends or my friends hold views that are distinctively different to my own? And there aren't that many of them, I have to say. So unless I'm given a real experience where, like the experience that you were given in a citizens jury, it's very difficult to imagine that we're going to get to a point where we can take each other seriously in ways that are going to lead to good outcomes for everyone. So I think that's what we'd be giving up.
Yeah, imagine that bar model if we didn't need to get together and
Yeah.
some computer calculated the best process for us and published that
Well,
document for the
that
council.
has been suggested, by the way. So there's been a suggestion that instead of voting in an election, that we just hand it over to AI and we say, all right, well,
Oh yeah.
you know what we look at. I mean, obviously, Cambridge Analytica knew what we looked at. So just have a look at our history online and just vote. Now, in many ways, if that was done accurately, that would probably lead to a better outcome, because at the moment, people vote contrary to their interests. We saw that in the US. You know, the people who are voting for people that are not actually, they don't have their interests at heart, and it's not going to lead to the kind of outcomes that would be better for them, because, you know, they've been, for whatever reason, hoodwinked into voting for someone else. So the people who put forward that idea, you think, well, that would be good. We also know that when people go online and they look at the kind of platforms prior to an election that say, what do you think about all of these policies? And then at the end of it, they say, okay, you should be voting for this party. And inevitably, that's not the party they're voting for, because their policies are matching a party that they are not prepared to vote for, because they vote for a brand, or they vote, you know, it's the whole kind of emotion that kicks
Branding.
in
Yeah.
rather than reason. So yeah, I mean, you could argue that AI is going to end up with a more reasonable outcome than the kind of outcomes that we're currently getting. It's just that inevitably it's also vulnerable to manipulation as well.
But even that, what you were saying before, let's say let's take this example, the bar model. We don't organize a citizen jury. We just have a computer calculate the best strategy and the best process, and council uses that. And it's a good, let's even say it would be a good result, a good solution.
Mm-hmm.
Would we still not be giving up something as humans?
Yeah, I do. I think that democracy was always about responsibility. It was always about rights and responsibilities, which is why I've always thought compulsory voting in Australia is perfectly valid. It's the responsibility of a citizen to do something, to make a contribution. And I think that notion of rights and responsibilities is a very important combination. So in the example that you just gave, well, there you go. We're going to do this, so we're going to maintain your rights, but where is the responsibility that comes with that? You've just handed it over to an algorithm or whatever. And I think that makes us better citizens. If we own decisions, we are much more likely to respect them, to want to abide by laws and so on, if we have been part of their formulation. And I think we've moved a long way from that. And I think the example you just gave would take us even further away.
Yeah, what I think about is that having to go through those processes and to think about that stuff makes us smarter and wiser. And even if we fail, it makes us smarter and wiser.
Exactly.
Um, but yeah, we're getting to my favorite question, which is what makes a human human? And this is my last question now. You being a professor, you have a sound knowledge of history, and corruption and lies have been a major part of the political life, political history. So much that political structures such as republics, democracies, or systems that try and put boundaries to the power one man can have. And governments can be corrupted by several things: the thirst of power of their own leaders, but also their entanglement with religious institutions or corporations these days. So in your opinion, where does the corruptibility of the government stem from? Is it that we fail to build solid, incorruptible systems? Or is it that we fail to strengthen our characters and morality as conscious human beings? Is it the system that's the issue? Is it the nature of the human being that's the issue?
It's both, I think. And I'm not sure that corruption and lies have always been a major part of political life, because our vulnerability to corruption and lies has always been there. So I think it is part of the human condition. But if we go full circle and end up back in ancient Athens, then they were definitely trying to counteract that human tendency, which is why they ended up with this system of lotteries, with decision makers. I mean, they had a whole bunch of other things that we don't have time to talk about, but almost all of the systems that they put in place were designed to counteract that. So it is, I think, a combination of both. I think America is going to be a very interesting example for us to watch. I think it's what it's experiencing right now. Are its systems going to be strong enough to withstand a buffoon as a president, who is just, wow, slightly off the air, doing all sorts of wild stuff. And so far, the systems have been able to constrain his activities. I mean, that's not true in other countries. The systems, particularly when you find new democracies, you mentioned Brazil before. There's, very scary stuff happening in Brazil right now, which is really just making a mockery of its newly developed systems that it was putting in place to defend itself against that kind of corruption and lies, and it hasn't been able to do that successfully. It's not the only country. It's kind of all over the world now, as we know, that systems have to be incredibly tough, because the US has been at this for a lot longer than those emerging democracies. That's why I think it's an interesting case study. Can it withstand it? Can the UK withstand its current distress over Brexit and the likelihood that it too may elect a buffoon as its prime minister? Well, we'll see what happens there in the next few weeks. But
many buffoons in the world, for sure.
There are many buffoons who will happily step up to the plate and say, elect me as your leader. So yes, we need incredibly strong systems to ensure that people who are just off the air, psychopaths or people with personality disorders, let's face it, anyone who seeks power probably should be denied it. The ancient Greeks.
Yeah, that's what I thought I heard. Yeah,
clearly, they were very famous for saying that if you're going to, be in the running for leadership, there's a fair chance that you probably have a personality disorder or two. It's a very unusual leader at a national level who doesn't. So I think we need to be very wary of that, and to therefore establish systems that can withstand craziness.
That's such a great answer regarding the systems part of this question. But I'm very, very interested in the other aspect, which is the nature of the human being, and this question of our relationship to power. And now we're going full circle with the beginning of this interview, where you started speaking about power. How do us humans relate to power? You just said most likely if you're human craves for power, there's something not right. And,
I think we all crave power. I think you do and I do. It's probably much more subtle than the kind of power we were just talking about. I think there is something alluring, something fabulous about power that I think we do all want it in some measure. It's just that it has a destructive face and a constructive face. So it can be used for good and it can also be used for evil. But I think we like to be on top. There's no question about it. We like to be the ones who have the influence or whatever, because we all consider that we are good people and that we'll use it well, even if that's not true. Um, I just think we're a kind of strange species, don't you think? That
Oh, for sure.
yeah, and that we seem to be intent on destroying ourselves just strikes me as quite extraordinary. Um, and that's got to be a human tendency to be able to just shut off from all that we see that is happening, and to vote in an election based on our superannuation entitlement or something just seems so ridiculous. But it's what we do.
Yeah, I heard that sentence for the first time during the last election in Australia, that people vote with their wallet.
Yeah.
Uh, it seems to be a reality, but yeah, um, people who are in power in not just in governments, any type of structure, tend to power seems to corrupt. That's a very old saying, but it also developed. It's like people see power as a bad thing now, and I think that also has a very negative impact on our human minds, because the opposite side of things is that if you have a really good intent and integrity and you refuse power, then who's going to do the good things in the world?
But you've just had an experience of power in a citizens' jury.
Yeah,
And I
shared
see
power.
that as a positive example of, so if you're sharing power with a group of people, it's actually pretty positive. You're all looking to come up with good recommendations that were going to benefit everyone. So there was power residing in that, but it was quite positive power.
True.
It's usually
There's
when
a
it's individualized that it's problematic. And I would have to say, even though I've flippantly said that we're all intent on destroying ourselves, well, we're not all intent on destroying ourselves. There's an inordinate number of people who are expending a lot of energy trying to prevent that from happening. So it isn't true that we are all doing this blindly, heading towards the cliff face and throwing ourselves off. There's a lot of people who are thinking hard and acting well in order to ensure that that doesn't happen. So I think we always have that, we've got to see the two faces of power and circumstance.
They are, and I'm trying to meet many of them and interview them.
Good for you. You're doing your bit.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Carson. It was wonderful.
It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
The Future Seeds podcast is a project that is supported by its community of listeners. If you like the show and what it stands for, I invite you to head to www.futureseeds.news, where you can support the show for just $2 a month, be part of the Future Seeds community, connect with its amazing members and speakers, and enable this podcast to thrive. I thank you for your time and hope you enjoy the show and its exploration of alternative solutions to the world's greatest challenges.